Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the 1932 Bonus Army. We're looking at a truly profound moment in American history, a time when tens of thousands of impoverished World War I veterans literally marched on Washington, D.C. Their goal was pretty simple, yet born out of pure desperation. They were demanding the federal government keep a financial promise it had made to them years earlier. It's a fascinating story that blends military history, economic collapse, and civil rights into a really powerful narrative about citizenship and government responsibility. Picture this, right? It's the sweltering summer of 1932. Decorated war heroes, men who had survived the absolute nightmare of the European trenches, have traded in their crisp military uniforms for makeshift tents pitched in the muddy fields of the nation's capital. As they looked around, it hit them. They had survived the battlefields of World War I, sure, but upon returning home and facing the devastating onset of the Great Depression, they found themselves fighting a completely different battle. A battle against rampant unemployment, grinding poverty, and just everyday hunger. All right, here's how we're going to break this down chronologically. A promise deferred, the Great Depression hits, marching on Washington, the violent eviction, and finally, the legacy of the Bonus Army. Starting right off with Section 1, a promise deferred. We absolutely have to begin by understanding the original obligation the federal government made to its returning soldiers, because without this context, the march itself just doesn't make sense. Notice the agonizing gap in time here. World War I ends in 1918. By 1924, the government officially recognizes a debt to these soldiers. But look closely at these next two dates. The Great Depression hits in 1929, completely wiping out the economy, right? Yet the bonus the veterans were promised wasn't actually scheduled for payment until 1945. That is an agonizing 13-year gap between the devastating economic crash that ruined these men's livelihoods and the date they were actually supposed to get paid. So to understand that gap, we need to look at what exactly was passed in 1924. The Adjusted Compensation Act was designed to compensate veterans for the wages they lost while they were overseas serving their country. But instead of cash, the government gave them certificates. Essentially, these were government-issued IOUs. While well-intentioned on paper, a certificate maturing 2 decades in the future was fundamentally useless to a family struggling to survive the present moment. You literally can't eat an IOU, and you sure can't use it to pay your rent. Which brings us to Section 2. The Great Depression hits. This reveals the severe macroeconomic reality that ultimately forced these veterans' hands and pushed them to take drastic action. Just look at this jarring shift. Back in 1924, decorated heroes were handed secure government certificates representing a stable future. Fast forward to 1932, and the reality was rampant bank failures wiping out life savings, endless breadlines, soaring nationwide unemployment, and widespread homelessness. The tragic contrast between the dignity of their military service and the extreme poverty they faced less than a decade later is just heartbreaking. And honestly, the crucial point here is that waiting for 1945 was simply no longer an option. When your family is going hungry today, a promise of money 13 years from now doesn't put food on the table. This sheer economic hardship transformed these national heroes into a mobilized group with a single, highly urgent demand. So that leads us to part 3, marching on Washington. Facing absolute starvation, these veterans decided they had to take their grievances directly to the source. They organized into what became known as the Bonus Expeditionary Force, led by a veteran named Walter W. Waters. Over 20,000 veterans and their families arrived in Washington, D.C. And they didn't just hop on a quick flight. They traveled all across the country via freight trains, hitchhiking, and just walking, all to peacefully demand the early payment of their promised bonus. Once they arrived, they had to figure out how to survive. They built massive tent communities right on the muddy fields near the Capitol, most famously on the Anacostia Flats. But it wasn't just chaos. Remember, these were former military men, so they established incredible discipline. They organized highly functional community kitchens to feed thousands. Whole families, wives, kids, lived and protested together in these makeshift camps. And most importantly, they maintained strictly peaceful demonstrations. What started as a mere protest quickly became a highly organized temporary city built by citizens who truly believed they had earned the right to be heard by their elected officials. The sheer scale of their presence sparked massive, heated congressional debates. And for a moment there, it really looked like they might win. The House of Representatives actually approved the early payout. But shortly after, the Senate rejected the bill. This legislative defeat set up a highly tense, prolonged standoff between the thousands of veterans occupying the Capitol and the Hoover administration, which was absolutely determined to maintain order and fiscal restraint. And this takes us to Section 4, the violent eviction. Let's see how this built into one of the most controversial moments of the era, as the government ultimately responded to this peaceful occupation. Things escalated rapidly. First, federal orders were officially issued to clear the camps, leading to tragic initial clashes with the local Washington police. As the situation deteriorated, the Hoover administration made the fateful decision to deploy the active U.S. Army to remove the veterans. Under the command of notable military figures like General Douglas MacArthur, along with Majors Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton, the military moved in. Cavalry and infantry units actively used tear gas to disperse the crowds of veterans and their families, ultimately setting the makeshift camps on fire to ensure they wouldn't return. As you can imagine, the visual impact of this event was just devastating. Images of active, uniformed American soldiers confronting former American soldiers, choking on tear gas and watching their temporary homes burn. It completely shocked the American public. Impartially speaking, this violent domestic military operation became a defining, deeply unpopular moment of the Depression era, and it severely damaged President Hoover's already fragile public standing heading into the next election. Finally, we reach Section 5, Legacy of the Bonus Army. Now, despite the heartbreaking tragedy of the eviction and the immediate failure to get their bonus in 1932, the Bonus Army actually didn't fail in the long run. Their actions set off a massive chain reaction. After the 1932 eviction, the administration changes. In 1933, the new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, though he didn't initially support the early cash bonus either, offered the veterans jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps. But the veterans and their advocates, they kept pushing. By 1936, the political pressure was insurmountable, and Congress officially overrode President Roosevelt's veto, finally granting the World War I veterans their early bonus payment. And perhaps most significantly, in 1944, the mobilization of the Bonus Army directly influenced the creation of the GI Bill for World War II veterans, ensuring a whole new generation wouldn't face that same destitution. The impact of their march literally cannot be overstated. They completely reshaped the national conversation about how veterans should be treated. They forced a major redefinition of the government's responsibility to its citizens during times of crisis. They paved the way for the sweeping educational and housing benefits of the GI Bill. Ultimately, their willingness to peacefully assemble transformed them from forgotten heroes into highly effective political activists, permanently laying the groundwork for the modern federal military benefits we all recognize today. The Bonus Army remains one of the most important demonstrations in American history. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to think about. When you look at modern monuments honoring our military and think about the complex relationship between military service and public responsibility, consider this defining question from their incredible struggle. How should nations truly fulfill their obligations to those who served? It's a huge question that the men and women on the Anacostia Flats forced America to answer, and one that remains incredibly relevant today. Thanks so much for joining me.